A new dynasty, a nation on edge. The year 1603 marked a moment that sent shockwaves through every corner of England. After decades of stability under Elizabeth I, the country suddenly found itself under the rule of a new family, the House of Stuart. For most people alive, Elizabeth was the only monarch they'd ever known. Her death wasn't just the end of an era, it was the start of a chapter filled with anxiety and suspicion. Whispers spread through crowded markets and candlelit taverns. Would the new king, James I, keep the peace, or would he drag the nation into chaos? England was already a land divided. Beneath the surface, religious tensions simmered. Catholics and Protestants eyed each other with distrust, while Puritans grumbled that the Reformation hadn't gone far enough. Economic uncertainty added to the unease, as old feudal systems clashed with new money and rising merchants. And in the halls of power, Parliament was growing restless, eager to test its strength against the crown. The people sensed that the rules were changing, but no one could predict just how quickly the ground would shift beneath their feet. The age of the Stuarts had begun, and with it, a storm was gathering that would soon sweep across the entire kingdom. But the real turmoil was only just beginning. Parliament's power play. While the Stuarts settled into the throne, another force was quietly gathering strength: Parliament. For centuries, it had been little more than a tool for the crown, summoned when the monarch needed money or support. But by the early 1600s, Parliament was no longer content to play second fiddle. Its members, many of them fiercely Puritan, were determined to push England further from Catholic traditions and closer to their own vision of a godly nation. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, a failed attempt by Catholic conspirators to blow up Parliament and the king, briefly united the country in fear and outrage. But that unity didn't last. Instead, it deepened the divide, making Parliament even more suspicious of royal motives. James I, the new king, quickly found himself in a bind. His lavish spending and grand ambitions demanded more money than Parliament was willing to provide. When they refused, he tried to sidestep them, raising customs duties, forcing loans from the wealthy, and handing out lucrative monopolies to his favorites. Parliament saw these moves as a direct attack on their authority and the rights of Englishmen. Tensions boiled over, and James dissolved Parliament not once, but twice, hoping to rule without their interference. But Parliament was not so easily silenced. In 1624, they struck back with the Act of Monopolies, stripping the king of his power to grant exclusive trading rights. For the first time, Parliament had directly taken a weapon out of the monarch's hands. It was a bold move, and it sent a clear message. The days of unchecked royal power were numbered, but the real storm was just beginning. The king who went. Too far when James I passed the crown to his son, Charles I, few could have guessed just how far the new king would push the boundaries of royal power. Charles inherited not only the throne, but also his father's financial headaches, and a parliament that was more defiant than ever. Desperate for cash to fund his wars and royal lifestyle, Charles turned to increasingly aggressive tactics. He demanded forced loans from the wealthy, many of them members of Parliament themselves, threatening imprisonment for anyone who refused. The king's heavy hand didn't stop there. In the South, ordinary people found their homes seized. To house soldiers and martial law was declared in entire regions, leaving citizens feeling like strangers in their own land. Parliament, alarmed by these abuses, responded with the Petition of Right in 1628, a document that spelled out basic freedoms: no taxes without Parliament's consent, no arbitrary imprisonment, no forced billeting of soldiers, and no martial law. It was a direct challenge to the king's authority, and for a moment, it seemed like Charles might back down. But instead, he dissolved Parliament the very next year, determined to rule alone. For 11 long years, Charles governed by royal decree, reviving old taxes, enforcing medieval laws, and jailing anyone who dared to resist. What began as a typical struggle between king and Parliament had transformed into something far more dangerous: a monarch who saw himself above the law, and a nation teetering on the edge of rebellion. But when Parliament finally returned, it was out for revenge. England tears itself apart. When Charles I finally recalled Parliament in 1640, it wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was a desperate move to raise funds for a war against rebellious Scots. But Parliament had changed. No longer content to be the king's piggy bank, its members demanded real power, forcing Charles to accept regular meetings and even impeaching his closest advisors. The tension reached a breaking point when Charles, in a shocking display of royal arrogance, stormed into Parliament with armed guards, demanding the arrest of 5 leading MPs. But the targets had already slipped away, and the message was clear. The old rules no longer applied. With trust shattered, both sides began to prepare for the unthinkable. Charles fled to York and started raising an army, while Parliament called up its own troops. The country split in two. Royalists, known as Cavaliers, rallied in the north and west, while Parliament's Roundheads, with their distinctive cropped hair, took control of the south and east. The first major clash at Edgehill ended in a bloody stalemate, but the war quickly escalated. Victories and defeats piled up on both sides, but the arrival of a Scottish army to support Parliament turned the tide. Crushing defeats at Marston Moor and Naseby left the Royalists reeling, their forces shattered. By the time Charles surrendered, England was a nation scarred by violence. Over 300,000 lives had been lost, a staggering toll for a country of its size. Yet even with the king in chains, the struggle for power was far from over. Parliament, now wary of its own army's growing influence, faced a new dilemma: what to do with a defeated king and a restless nation. But the next chapter would prove even more unpredictable. Cromwell's Commonwealth. From revolution to dictatorship, with the king defeated and Parliament in control, England seemed poised for a new era of freedom. But the reality was far more complicated. The army that had won the war, led by the fiercely determined Oliver Cromwell, soon became a power unto itself. Parliament, already divided, found itself outmaneuvered by Cromwell and his loyal officers. When royalist uprisings flared up again in 1648, Cromwell crushed them with ruthless efficiency, convinced that as long as Charles III lived, the old order could return at any moment. In a move that stunned Europe, Cromwell and his allies purged Parliament of moderates, put the king on trial for treason, and sent him to the scaffold. The execution of Charles the III was a moment that shocked the world. A king, beheaded by his own people. England was declared a commonwealth, but the promise of liberty quickly faded. Cromwell's rule was marked by harsh measures and strict Puritan morality. In Ireland, his campaign left a legacy of brutality, with entire towns massacred and land seized for his supporters. At home, Cromwell's major generals acted as enforcers, banning gambling, fining drunkards, and even outlawing Christmas celebrations. The country, once weary of royal excess, now found itself suffocating under a new kind of dictatorship, one that policed not just politics, but daily life. Cromwell's regime grew so unpopular that even those who had fought for Parliament began to long for the return of the monarchy. When Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard proved too weak to hold power. In a twist no one saw coming, Parliament invited Charles II, the exiled son of the executed king, to return. The monarchy was restored, but England would never be the same. And while the nation struggled with its identity at home, its ambitions abroad were about to explode. Empire unleashed, colonies, conflict, and controversy. While England wrestled with revolution and restoration at home, its gaze was shifting outward, hungry for new lands and new fortunes. The Americas became the stage for a bold experiment, one that would shape the world for centuries. The first permanent English colony took root in Virginia, its survival hanging by a thread until tobacco transformed it into a gold mine. Soon, waves of settlers crossed the Atlantic, driven by dreams of land, wealth, and religious freedom. Puritans, frustrated by the slow pace of reform at home, founded their own communities in New England, determined to build a society on their own terms. But colonization was anything but orderly. Private adventurers, religious refugees, and ambitious merchants all carved out their own pieces of the New World, often with little oversight from the crown. This chaotic expansion brought the English into constant conflict with Native Americans, whose lands and lives were swept aside by the relentless push westward. Early years saw uneasy alliances in trade, but as settlements grew, violence erupted. Wars like the Pequot War and King Philip's War left scars that would never fully heal. The Caribbean, meanwhile, became England's sugar bowl, its plantations worked by enslaved Africans whose suffering fueled the empire's wealth. The rise of piracy turned the region into a battleground, as outlaws preyed on the riches flowing back to England. And across the globe, the East India Company planted its flag in India, laying the groundwork for a new kind of empire, one built on trade, influence, and eventually, domination. England's reach was growing, but so were the shadows cast by its ambition. Yet even as the empire expanded, the real revolution was brewing back home, in the minds, markets, and inventions of a restless people. Revolutions at home. Science, money, and the glorious upheaval. England's empire stretched across oceans. A quieter but equally powerful revolution was transforming life at home. The 17th century became an age of astonishing breakthroughs, where curiosity and ambition rewrote the rules of science, business, and even government. In the world of ideas, the English scientific revolution shattered centuries of tradition. William Harvey's discoveries about the circulation of blood changed medicine forever. But it was Isaac Newton who truly redefined humanity's understanding of the universe. His theories of gravity and motion, along with the invention of calculus, didn't just make him a legend. They set the stage for the modern world. But it wasn't just science that was changing. England's fields were being transformed by an agricultural revolution. New crops, smarter rotations, and better tools meant that famine faded into memory, and ordinary people could expect fuller tables and new luxuries like tea, coffee, and tobacco. Meanwhile, a financial revolution was underway. Joint stock companies and the founding of the Bank of England in 1694 turned London into the beating heart of global commerce. Suddenly, wealth wasn't just about land or titles. It was about trade, investment, and the freedom to pursue profit. Yet perhaps the most dramatic change came with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. When the Catholic James II tried to turn back the clock, Parliament acted. Instead of another bloody civil war, they invited William and Mary to take the throne, ending Catholic rule without a single shot fired. England's unwritten constitution, an evolving patchwork of laws, traditions, and bold experiments, proved flexible enough to survive crisis after crisis. The balance of power shifted decisively toward Parliament, setting a precedent for limited government and individual rights. And as the 18th century dawned, England stood ready to shape the world in ways no one could have imagined. The Empire Ascendant. From civil war to world power, as the 18th century opened, England was no longer just a kingdom. It was the heart of a new superpower. The Acts of Union in 1707 fused England and Scotland into Great Britain, forging a single nation with ambitions that stretched far beyond its own shores. The new Union Jack flew over bustling ports, distant colonies, and battlefields across the globe. Yet, even as the monarchy's power faded, new forces were rising at home. Parliament became the true center of authority, and political life split into two camps, the conservative Tories and the reform-minded Whigs. Out of this rivalry emerged figures like Sir Robert Walpole, often called Britain's first prime minister, who steered the country through decades of change, even though the title itself didn't officially exist. But Britain's greatest struggles and triumphs were now playing out far from home. The 18th century was an age of global conflict. The War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War dragged Britain into battles on nearly every continent. The cost was staggering, nearly bankrupting the nation, but the rewards were even greater. Victories in India, especially at the Battle of Plassey, gave the East India Company control over Bengal and opened the door to a vast new empire in Asia. Meanwhile, the defeat of France in North America set the stage for British dominance in the Atlantic world. Yet, every triumph came with a price. The taxes imposed to pay for these wars would spark outrage in the American colonies, planting the seeds of a revolution that would one day shake the empire to its core. At home, the old wounds of civil war and religious strife never fully healed, lurking beneath the surface of Britain's newfound confidence. The sun may have risen on the British Empire, casting its light from Boston to Bengal, but the shadows of its turbulent past were never far behind. And as Britain marched into a new century, the world would soon discover that every empire, no matter how mighty, carries the weight of its own history.